My name is Sophia. I'm 38 years old, and for 3 weeks I shared a bed, shared meals, and shared my deepest fears with a man I thought was my husband, while my real husband lay unconscious in a hospital across the city, fighting to survive. I need you to understand something before I begin. I am not a paranoid person. I am not someone who sees shadows where there are none. I am a woman who ran a business, managed properties, raised a home, and loved her husband for 11 years. I am someone who trusted her instincts. And my instincts failed me completely. It started on a Tuesday night. An ordinary, forgettable Tuesday. Daniel had just returned from a 5-day business trip to Frankfurt. He came through the door smelling like airport coffee and cold air, dropped his suitcase in the hallway the way he always did, slightly to the left of the rack, never actually on it, and kissed me on the cheek before raiding the refrigerator. I remember laughing at him as he stood there in his coat, still wearing his shoes, eating leftover pasta directly from the container. That was my husband. That was the man I knew. We settled onto the couch around 9 o'clock. I had been saving a horror movie for when he got back because Daniel loves horror films and I hate watching them alone. The lights were off, a bowl of popcorn between us, his arm resting behind my shoulders in that lazy, comfortable way married couples do when touch becomes automatic. I remember feeling content. Not dramatically happy, just quietly, deeply content. The kind of feeling you only recognize later, once it's gone. 40 minutes into the film, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. The screen showed my sister's name, Maya, and I assumed she was calling to ask something mundane. What time are you free this weekend, or did Mom call you yet? I silenced it once. She called again immediately. I picked up with a sigh. Maya, I'm watching a movie, can I? Sophia, her voice stopped me cold. I had never heard my sister sound like that. Maya is the composed one, the practical one. The one who stayed calm when our father had a heart attack 6 years ago, who made the phone calls and coordinated the doctors while I stood in the corridor unable to breathe. To hear her voice shaking, to hear her fighting to control it, made my stomach drop before she had even said another word. Sophia, listen to me very carefully. Daniel was in an accident, a serious one. He's in surgery right now. You need to come to St. Aurelius Hospital. You need to come now. I laughed. I genuinely laughed. Not from cruelty, but from pure, involuntary confusion. Because my husband was sitting 11 inches to my left, his hand now paused mid-reach for the popcorn, watching me with slightly furrowed brows. I looked at him. He looked at me. Maya, I said, still almost smiling, that's not possible. Daniel is sitting right here next to me. Sophia. He's right here, I'm looking at him. There was a pause, then she said very quietly, please just come. Something in those 3 words, the way she said them, like she was choosing them very carefully, like every other word was too dangerous, made my smile fade. I looked at Daniel again. He held out his hand gently for the phone. I gave it to him. He spoke to her for maybe 40 seconds. His face was calm, politely puzzled, the expression of a man who is humoring a misunderstanding. When he handed the phone back, he said exactly what I expected him to say. It must be a mix-up. Hospitals confuse identities more often than people realize. There was probably a wallet involved or someone gave his name by mistake. He paused. But go see what's happening. You won't be able to sleep unless you do. I stood at our front door for a moment before leaving. I don't know why I paused there. Some instinct I couldn't name. I turned and looked back at Daniel. He was already facing the television again, but he turned when he felt my eyes on him and gave me a small, reassuring smile. Text me when you get there, he said. I drove to the hospital telling myself the whole way that this was nothing. A clerical error. An anxious sister. I would arrive, find a stranger who happened to share Daniel's name or maybe carry his lost ID, and I would drive home embarrassed by the drama of it all. Maya was waiting for me at the entrance. The moment I saw her face, her eyes red and raw, Her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. My certainty crumbled. She didn't speak. She simply took my arm and walked me inside. The hospital at night has a particular quality of silence that is nothing like peace. It is a silence filled with the low hum of machines, the soft, urgent footsteps of nurses, the distant sound of someone crying behind a closed door. The fluorescent lights give everyone the same pallor. I remember noticing that my own hands looked gray under them. We stopped outside the surgical recovery unit. A doctor in scrubs was waiting. She introduced herself. I cannot remember her name, I have tried, and she asked me to confirm mine. Mrs. Carter, Sophia Carter. Yes. Your husband was brought in approximately 3 hours ago following a head-on collision on the Eastern Expressway. He lost significant blood, and there was cranial trauma, but he survived surgery. He's stable. He's going to need time, but he's stable. I heard the words. They entered my ears in the correct order, but my brain refused to assemble them into meaning. There's been a mistake, I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from another room. My husband is at home, I just left him. The doctor looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully compassionate. The face of someone who has delivered devastating news many times and has learned that the mind protects itself from truth in the first minutes. She opened the door. And I saw him. He was lying in the hospital bed beneath white sheets, his head partially bandaged, one arm connected to an IV line. There were cuts along his jaw. His left hand rested open at his side. On that hand, on that particular finger, was his wedding ring, our wedding ring. The one I had placed there 11 years ago, the one with the small engraving on the inside that had been his grandmother's idea. Always finding you. His face was bruised and swollen but unmistakable. It was Daniel. Every feature, the small scar near his right eyebrow from a childhood fall he had told me about on our second date. The shape of his hands, I had always loved his hands, the way they looked capable and gentle at the same time. Even unconscious, even broken, he was absolutely, undeniably my husband. My knees gave out. Maya caught me. I stood there for a long time just staring because my brain was caught in an impossible loop. The man in this bed was Daniel. The man on my couch was Daniel. Both of these things were true. Both of them were impossible. One of them was a lie. And I had no idea which one. I excused myself. I told Maya I needed air. I walked outside into the cold night, sat down on a concrete bench near the ambulance bay, and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. Hey, how is it? Was it a mix-up? His voice was warm, familiar, slightly tired the way he always sounded late at night. I'm at the hospital, I said carefully. I saw him, Daniel, the man in there, he looks exactly like you. A short silence, then a quiet low laugh, not dismissive, just easy, relaxed. Same height, same general type. Same scar above the eye, same hands, same ring. A longer pause this time. Sophia, people have similar features, and you're stressed. You went in already expecting to see me, so your brain. He's wearing your wedding ring. The pause that followed was barely a second. If I hadn't been listening for it, I would have missed it. That's strange, he said slowly. But possible. If he had my wallet, maybe my details, maybe someone gave him the ring to hold, or it could be a coincidence. Wedding rings all look similar. And the terrible thing, the truly terrible thing, is that he almost convinced me, because he said it so calmly, because the alternative was so monstrous that my mind actively wanted to accept his version. I went home that night and told myself I would wait. That clarity would come, that there was a rational explanation somewhere in the space between two identical men. In the days that followed, I watched him. I watched him the way you watch someone when you are trying to catch them being someone they are not, carefully, constantly, without letting them know you are doing it. I studied his routines, his reflexes, his humor. I tested him, gently, with small questions only Daniel would know. The name of the restaurant where we had our first date. The nickname he had for his childhood dog. What I wore on the night he proposed. He answered every question correctly. Not hesitantly. Not after a suspicious pause. Immediately, naturally, with the small laugh or the specific detail that made it feel real. He knew that the restaurant was called Vesper, and that I had ordered the wrong thing and pretended to love it. He knew the dog's name was Archie and that Daniel had cried the day Archie died, even though he insisted he hadn't. He knew I wore a blue dress the night of the proposal, and that afterward, walking back to the car, I had stepped in a puddle and ruined my shoes, and he had laughed so hard I'd had to remind him he'd just proposed. How do you argue with that? How do you look at a man who has just perfectly recalled the ruined shoes, and the puddle and the laughter, and tell him he is not your husband? I couldn't, so I waited. But I kept going back to the hospital. Every 2 or 3 days, I invented an excuse and I drove to St. Aurelius, and I sat beside the man in the bed. For the first week he was still unconscious. I sat there and watched his chest rise and fall, and I looked at his face, and I felt the same. I at devastation every time, because he looked like home. The nurses began recognizing me. One of them, a young woman named Priya who had kind eyes and moved quietly, would sometimes bring me tea without my asking. I think she understood that I was not simply worried. I think she understood that something deeper was happening that I couldn't explain. I began noticing things at home. Small things. The kind of things you would never notice unless you were specifically looking. Daniel, the Daniel at home, made his coffee differently. Only slightly. The real Daniel always made it too strong and then added extra milk directly from the carton, sloppy and quick. This Daniel made it strong but precise. Small thing, probably meaningless. The real Daniel hummed when he was thinking. Badly, tunelessly, always the same half melody that drove me gently insane. This Daniel was quiet when he thought. The real Daniel, when he hugged me from behind, always rested his chin on the top of my head. This Daniel rested his chin on my shoulder. None of these things were evidence. None of them were proof. They were impressions, feelings, the kind of thing a lawyer would dismantle in 6 seconds. But they accumulated. 3 weeks after the accident, Maya called me again. It was late evening. I was in the kitchen pretending to read while Daniel, the one at home, sat in the study on his laptop. I stepped into the garden to take the call. Maya's voice had the same careful, contained quality. It had that first night outside the hospital. I found something, she said. And Sophia, I need you to listen to me without reacting where he can hear you. Can you do that? Yes, I said, my voice was steady. The rest of me was not. Come to the hospital tomorrow morning. Come alone, don't tell him where you're going. Maya had an office at the hospital. She worked in administration, which was how she had access to things most people couldn't reach. She locked the door. She sat across from me, and for a moment she just looked at me, and I could see that she had spent the night rehearsing how to say this. How to say it without shattering me completely. What I'm about to show you, she said quietly, I obtained through channels I'm not supposed to use, so some of this will need to be handled carefully. But you needed to know. You had the right to know. She opened her laptop and turned it toward me. The footage was from a private medical clinic, not a hospital, a clinic, discreet and expensive, the kind of place that does not advertise. The timestamp was from 14 months earlier. A man walked in. He was wearing a dark cap and a surgical mask, which wasn't unusual in a medical setting. But when he sat down across from the doctor and removed the mask, I recognized him immediately. Victor. Victor Hale, Daniel's best friend since university, the man who had been the best man at our wedding, the man who had sat at our dinner table dozens of times, who had birthday drinks with us in October, who called Daniel brother in the half-joking way that nonetheless meant something. Victor, whom I had never thought twice about. The footage continued. multiple visits, then surgical prep rooms, recovery rooms, medical documentation with photographs at various stages before, during, after surgery. His nose, his jaw, his brow ridge, his cheekbones, the scar above his eye. Created, recreated, perfected. My sister spoke quietly over the footage. The clinic specializes in identity reconstruction. Technically, they serve burn victims, severe accident cases, people who need full facial rehabilitation. But there is a separate practice they run privately for clients who can pay enough. She paused. Victor paid enough. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them flat against my thighs. The accident wasn't random, Maya continued. The police are already reviewing it. I spoke to someone I trust there. It was planned. The vehicle that hit Daniel ran a deliberate route. Stolen car, no plates. And it happened on a road Daniel only started using regularly in the last 3 months, which means someone had been tracking his movements. I thought about all the times Victor had come for dinner. All the times he had asked Daniel casually how work was going, whether he was still taking the same route to the airport, whether he was planning any trips soon. There's more. Maya reached across and touched my hand gently. The clinic keeps psychological evaluations for their more unusual cases. I was sent excerpts, I won't tell you by whom. The notes discuss Victor's stated motivations. She hesitated. Sophia, Victor was in love with you, had been for years. The records suggest it wasn't casual, it was consuming. He had built an entire framework around it. He convinced himself that your life should have been his life. Your marriage should have been his marriage. I stared at her. But that's not everything, she took a breath. I also referenced financial records, your company shares, the investment properties you and Daniel hold jointly. If Daniel had died in that accident and Victor had successfully become Daniel in every legal sense, identity documents, hospital records, eyewitness confirmation from a grieving wife who never doubted him, then Victor would have controlled everything. He wasn't just in love with you, Sophia. He wanted everything you represented, everything you both had built. I sat there in that locked office for a long time without speaking. I thought about the evening he came home from Frankfurt. The suitcase left slightly to the left of the rack, the pasta from the container, the arm behind my shoulder on the couch. I had thought those things made him real. I had thought familiarity was proof. He had studied my husband for years. He hadn't just copied his face, he had copied his life. I drove home slowly. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, cooking dinner, pasta, ironically, and he looked up and smiled and said, "You're later than I expected. Everything okay?" And I smiled back and said yes, just a long morning, sorry. That night I lay awake next to him until 3 in the morning. I listened to him breathe. I measured the space between us in the dark, and I thought about everything I was going to do next. I was not going to confront him, not yet. I was going to be patient. I was going to be methodical. And I was going to make sure that when the moment came, he had nowhere to go. Over the next 4 weeks, I became someone I did not entirely recognize. By day, I was a loving wife. Attentive, warm, present. I let him take my hand during walks. I laughed at his jokes. I cooked his favorite meals on weekends and asked about his work with genuine-sounding interest. I was, by every external measure, completely unsuspecting. By night, and in the hours I carved out alone under the pretense of errands and visiting friends, I built the case. Maya connected me with a lawyer she trusted, a woman named Arian who had handled fraud cases before and who listened to my story over 3 hours without flinching, and then said, calmly, "We can work with this." Arian guided me on what evidence was needed, what would hold in court, what would not. Together, we gathered the clinic footage, the financial transfer records connecting Victor to the surgical team, phone records, the police report on the accident, security camera footage from the road that night, and medical documentation from St. Aurelius confirming the identity of the real Daniel Carter through records that predated Victor's surgical transformation. We built the case piece by piece, quietly, and without a single error. The real Daniel remained at the hospital. He was awake now. His recovery was slower than the doctors had hoped. The cranial trauma had affected his speech initially, though that improved week by week. I visited him 6 times during those 4 weeks. I held his hand. The first time he opened his eyes and recognized me, he said my name in a voice so rough and broken it sounded nothing like I remembered, and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry since this began. He didn't know yet what had happened. We kept it from him until he was stronger. His only reality was pain, confusion, and the slow crawl back toward himself. But he knew me. Every time I visited, he knew me, and that was the thing I held onto.
This
Victor
towering
had been pushing for
baptisius
months to
wrist, captured
finalize
in
a legal
stunning
transfer of
4K,
financial
is a
authority over my
beacon for
business
wildlife.
assets.
With
He had framed it as practical protection in case something happened to either of us, standard marital planning. Our real estate attorney had raised no flag. It was a common enough document. Victor had been patient about it, never pushy, just periodically bringing it up the way a responsible partner might. He scheduled the final signing meeting for a Thursday afternoon. Conference room at the attorney's office, 2 witnesses, standard procedure. He arrived in a gray suit. He was relaxed, confident. He placed his hand briefly on my back as we walked into the room and asked if I wanted coffee. I said no, thank you. We sat down. The documents were placed before us. The attorney explained each clause in turn. Victor listened with the mild attentiveness of a man performing patience because he already knew what everything said. He had probably read it 20 times. Finally, the documents were in front of me, pen in hand. I looked down at the pages. I looked up at Victor. And I said, very quietly, before I sign anything, there's something I'd like everyone to see. His eyes moved to mine. Something flickered there, not fear yet, just a slight sharpening of attention, a predator noticing a new variable. I nodded to Arian, who was seated at the far end of the table, introduced earlier as my independent legal counsel, which had raised no particular suspicion. The wall screen activated. The clinic footage began to play. I watched Victor's face as he watched himself. I watched the color drain from it in real time, not all at once, but in stages like water leaving a glass. His jaw tightened. His shoulders rose. His hands, flat on the table, pressed down slowly. He said nothing for the first 20 seconds. Then he started to speak. Some version of this is absurd, you have no idea what. The door opened. 4 police officers walked in, accompanied by a detective in plainclothes who introduced himself, walked directly to Victor, and began reading him his rights. Victor looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not look away. The trial took several months. The defense attempted various angles, false identity of the clinic footage, questions about my mental state, procedural challenges to the evidence chain. None of it held. The case was meticulous because we had made it meticulous. Arian was extraordinary. The prosecution had the accident report, the surgical records, financial forensics, and the testimony of 2 former clinic employees who had been waiting for someone to ask them the right questions. Victor was convicted. Identity fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. The judge, when delivering the sentence, made a specific remark about the calculated, sustained, and deeply intimate nature of the crime, the deliberate construction of a false life inside the most private space of another person's existence. Life imprisonment. When the verdict was read, I sat very still. I had expected to feel something enormous, relief, triumph, grief, rage. Instead, I felt a vast, quiet emptiness. The kind that comes not from loss, but from the end of sustained terror. The kind your body needs before it remembers how to feel normal again. I visited Daniel the day after the verdict. He was sitting up in bed now. He had been moved to a rehabilitation unit. His speech had returned fully, though he still tired easily. There was a physio schedule on the whiteboard and a half-finished crossword on the bedside table. These small signs of his returning self made my throat tight every time I saw them. I sat down beside him. I took his hand, his real hand, with the ring, with the scar, with the particular way the fingers curled around mine that no surgery could have replicated perfectly, because some things live in the bone, in the reflex, in the 11 years of shared memory underneath. I told him everything. It took a long time. He listened without interrupting except once, when I told him about Victor, about the surgery, about the years of obsession documented in those clinic files. He closed his eyes for a moment and was silent. Then he opened them again and looked at me and said simply, "Are you okay?" Not "I can't believe it," not "how could I not have known," just "are you okay?" That was the moment I cried. The real crying, not the horror movie crying of fear and shock and desperate confusion, but the other kind. The kind that means you are finally safe. There are things that stay with you after something like this. Not the dramatic moments, not the courtroom, not the arrest, but the small ones. The coffee made too precisely. The missing hum. The chin on the shoulder instead of the top of the head. I think about how intimacy is not just memory. It is physical, habitual, embedded in 10,000 tiny gestures accumulated over years. Victor had done everything right. He had studied my husband, learned him, memorized him with a dedication that was, in its own way, a form of madness disguised as love. And still, underneath all of it, I felt something was wrong. I didn't trust that feeling. I argued myself out of it again and again. I told myself I was stressed, paranoid, unfair. I almost signed those papers. But the feeling was right. If there is anything I want you to carry from this story, it is that. Not the horror of what Victor did, not the mechanics of the fraud or the drama of the courtroom, but this. You know the people you love. You know them in ways that live below language. And when something is wrong, even when everything appears right, even when you cannot name the reason, even when the logical explanation seems more plausible than your instinct, do not dismiss yourself. Do not dismiss yourself. Daniel came home on a Sunday in early spring. He walked through the front door carrying a small bag, and he left his suitcase slightly to the left of the rack. He kissed me on the cheek. He went to the refrigerator and stood there in his coat, still wearing his shoes, and found leftover pasta, and started eating it directly from the container. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching him and I laughed, a full, actual laugh, the kind that surprised me. He looked up. "What?" he said, smiling with a forkful halfway to his mouth. "Nothing," I said, "absolutely nothing."